Hi, I'm Janet Hartin. I'm an environmental horticulturist with University of California Cooperative Extension in Southern California. Today my seminar topic is how to save water and beautify your landscape the sustainable way. We've all heard the term sustainable, sustainability, and it comes under many umbrellas and in many contexts. UC defines sustainability as meeting the needs of today's population without diminishing the ability of future populations to meet their needs. More simply put, sustainable landscaping leaves a greener footprint for our children's children. There are 6 core elements of sustainable landscaping. The first 2, which are incorporating plants suitable for your climate and your location, and water conservation, are the 2 elements that I'll be speaking about today. And the others tie in, and near the end of my presentation, I'll direct you to a couple websites where you can get further information on all of the topics involving sustainable landscaping. The first and most important point is if you want to save water, you want to select plants that will grow well in your climate. There's some plants that are drought efficient, that don't take a lot of water, but what good are they if you can plant them in your zone only to have them die a couple years later and you've wasted that time? Many of them may establish, but on down the line there's problems and you may lose them. If you look at these 2 pictures, you'll see some very, very different landscaping. You see some snowy trees in northern Minnesota, and you see a desert landscape in Coachella Valley, California. Of course, there's a big difference between those 2 locations in what plants will grow, thrive, and what your best bet is for success in your specific climate zone. There's a couple places that you can find your zone. One is the USDA map, and the other is the Sunset Zone map. We prefer that you use the Sunset Zone map because it's much more specific. The USDA zones are fewer, and they're only based on cold tolerance. They're based on the average low temperature, whereas Sunset, they include all kinds of criteria, such as the high temperatures average for that time of year and other climatic criteria. For instance, Zone 9B is inclusive of Palm Springs, Fresno, and San Bernardino in the USDA zone, whereas Sunset considers those 3 completely separate domains. An important aspect about water conservation in your garden and landscape is that plant water requirements vary, and they're directly related to what we call the evapotranspiration rate of that particular plant. You can think of ET as being analogous to plant water use. In other words, the water that's used directly through the plant's transpiration and through evaporation off the soil surface is approximation of the water need that that plant has to replace the water that was lost. There's 4 main factors that determine ET: solar radiation, temperature, wind speed, and relative humidity. If you're enthused about the topic, you can go to the simis.water.ca.gov website. It's fascinating. If you're into weather monitoring, you can find your zone. You can find out real time what the local weather conditions are. And you can try it out to irrigate your backyard if you have turf by using the numbers that you can download from the Simis station. Most of you probably don't want to go to that extent, and that's all right. We've done some things behind the scenes to be able to have this available information, but not have to have you do all the math and go on the Simis station to use the data. Let me illustrate a bit of differences and similarities in water use throughout Southern California, San Jose area, and up even into San Francisco. If you look at the peak of those 3 curves, you'll notice that July in each instance is the highest water demanding month of the year. You'll also notice that in Southern California inland valleys that for the spring and for the summer months almost double the amount of water than San Francisco Bay Area is lost through ET and therefore is required to be replenished. San Jose is about midway between those two. So if you're gardening in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you forget to change the number of minutes on your controller going out of the summer into the fall, or from spring into the summer, you're not going to be making the huge mistake you will be in Southern California inland valleys. It's not on this slide, but Coachella Valley would be at the top of that curve for July. So it's important in the drier climates and the higher solar radiation areas of the state to make sure that at least 4 times a year that you change the number of minutes on your system that you're irrigating your landscape and garden plants. Microclimates impact ET as well. Here's some examples of how in the same climate zone you can have differences in water needs due to other factors. We call those microclimates. Sun, shade, even air pollution, soil conditions, all of these factors do enter in determining how much water that a particular plant will take in one location versus another. So around your home, in your backyard, in your front yard, although you're in the same climate zone, there's going to be various microclimates. Those are the things that you need to concentrate on to make sure that you select plants that will grow well in any particular location. For instance, the same species of tree in a heat island can take twice or sometimes even more than twice the amount of water as that same species would in an open landscape setting or a park. The 4 factors that we'll be discussing next are the concept of hydrozoning, of scheduling irrigations based on plant needs, making sure that sprinklers in your drip system work properly, and how to successfully use mulch and soil amendments. Hydrozoning is basically 2 words put together that mean exactly as it says, and it's zoning according to water needs. You can see in these 2 pictures that any area with turf should be zoned separately and watered independently on a different schedule than areas that are either on drip systems or on sprinklers but require less water than the turf. Drip irrigation is a wonderful tool for your ornamentals. Anything that isn't growing as a crop, in other words, any of your non-ground cover and non-turf plantings, you might want to consider irrigating via drip because the water is applied directly into the root zone of the plant. Think about how much water in a situation where you have separate ornamentals and each one is being irrigated by the same sprinkler system with a lot of water lost between the plants. And then consider if you drip irrigated each one of those separately, you'd have the water seeping slowly into the root zone of the individual plants, and you would cut back drastically on the soil evaporation between the plants. Here's an illustration of the difference in water penetration and the time it takes for the water to penetrate in a sandy loam soil and in a clay loam soil. A lot of people think that a plant growing in sandy loam soil requires more water than the same plant would in a clay loam soil. That's actually not the case. What's important, though, is that the irrigation be scheduled differently in those 2 soils. If you take a look at this, you'll see that in the clay loam soil, it takes about 4 hours for that water from the sprinkler system or drip system to actually penetrate and drain down to the depth that in about 40 minutes the same water applied in a sandy soil would take. Notice also that when you're watering something in a loamy or clay soil, that you're going to have more horizontal, you're going to have more broad application of the water And that's because it's seeping in more slowly than if you irrigate in a sandy loam and it's going to go more quickly. It's pretty much straight down. Here's examples of 3 different soil textures. We use the term texture, which really is just type of soil. It's just a more technically correct phrase for that. You see that in the middle, you have what most of us would consider the best quality soil. That's a loamy soil, and it drains yet holds enough water for plants to be able to be scheduled based on their water needs in a much easier way than if you're trying to deal with the same plant planted in a really sandy soil or a clay loam or more clay-filled soil. One thing that we can do is to figure out in the root system that our plants are growing in now if the soil's dry, medium, or wet. One thing that's fun to do, and just takes a few minutes, is to dig around the roots carefully, but dig around the roots of your annuals, perennials, or trees, and dig down into where the crux and most of the roots actually are growing. Get a handful of soil and squeeze it. That'll give you a really good indication of whether it's really dry and very crumbly and just isn't holding any water, or medium, where it's just starting to crumble, but it's still held together fairly well, or so wet that it feels like a sponge that hasn't been wrung out. What you're aiming for is to irrigate after the water feels like most of, the soil feels like most of the water has been wrung out of it and it's ready for another application. You don't want it to get too dry, and you certainly don't want to keep watering it when it's very wet. I want to talk about turf and lawns just a minute. That's because most of the water that's applied in our landscapes that's lost and never really being able to take up in the landscape is that's irrigating warm and cool season grasses. When you think about it, it's because if you have a backyard that's full of cool season grasses or warm season turf, each of those plants is a separate entity, and each of those plants requires its own water. If you have a tree and the roots are growing over your backyard, you have one central core of xylem up the trunk of that tree. Therefore, you don't have to worry quite as much about the evenness of the water that's being applied around a tree as you do with a lawn or other ground cover that has thousands of separate entities, each requiring their own water. For that reason, you see a lot more water waste, and you see a lot more problems with irrigation, such as these pictures depict. You notice that there's a lot of problems with broken sprinklers, heads that don't pop up or get stuck, weeds growing around sprinkler heads that clog them, and the picture of the turf with the brown spots, rather than that being representative of disease, is simply representative of what we call a poor distribution uniformity. That means that the water that's being applied from your sprinkler is not applying it evenly across the surface of the grass. And then the temptation is to add more time, to go out and irrigate those brown spots longer and longer. And in the process, you often end up with diseases in the green areas. And it's much easier to put some cans out, measure the uniformity of the water, and go from there. We've got some help for you in the UC A&R's Lawn Watering Guide. We've done all the math behind the scenes. One thing you'll notice is that warm season grass is about 25 to 30% more efficient than cool season grass and requires less water. So therefore, if you download this publication, you'll be able to use it. You'll put some cans out to help determine both the precipitation rate of your irrigation system and also how evenly the water's being dispersed across your turf. It's fairly simple to use. We suggest you use it once every year or so. Then you'll get your own idea of what the flaws are in your system. You can fix them and and save probably 30 to 50% of the water that you were applying before you did the can test. If you still have a lawn and you're still enjoying it, fine, don't need to take it out, but consider grass cycling. Grass cycling is a process where instead of bagging once the leaves are cut and throwing away or composting the clippings, they're simply cut 3 times by the mower and they're redeposited on top of the turf area. It's a great mulch. It recycles nutrients. Over time, it adds organic matter back into the lawn. And of course, it reduces the footprint of green waste ending up in landfills. There's a grass that isn't particularly popular because it's not the green and the lush grass that a lot of people equate with a lawn. But you might want to check it out because in your particular case, maybe it's something that will suffice. And some of the newer varieties of buffalo grass look and perform a lot better than the older ones. But if you do choose buffalo grass, I think the icing on the cake for that is you can save about 50% of the water that you already are saving with warm season grass compared to cool season grass. It's the most water efficient of the warm season grasses. You can use about half of the minutes on the lawn watering guide to irrigate it. A lot of people are interested in field sedges. That's fine, but keep in mind that field sedge uses a fair amount of water, and it's more similar to the lawn watering guide's numbers for cool season grass than for warm season. If you've had it with your lawn, if you're fed up mowing, if you don't have kids or dogs anymore, if you're just not enjoying it, then you might want to think about some lawn alternatives. Woolly thyme is a great one. It's a low-growing ground cover. It's soft, it smells good, it's drought resistant, and it's also fairly cold tolerant. Another choice might be blue fescue. Again, low maintenance, you don't have to mow it. It's a real striking sort of blue evergreen. It's something in median strips that you'll see up and down a lot of the Southern California roadways. It's very attractive, has a nice shimmer to it. It grows about 6 inches tall and is also a nice replacement for a lawn if you're just not using it and don't want that maintenance anymore. Ceanothus is another genus with many, many species, many of which are ground covers, many of which will tolerate clay soil and also make a great lawn substitute. So that's another one if you want something with blue flowers to consider. A real unusual plant that you don't see used very much is called the inside-out flower. That's something that it could go dormant part of the year, which is a downside, but once it's established, it's pretty drought resistant and it does take some shade. Most of the other plants will not perform well in the shade. Another concept that I wanted to touch on is the water cycling aspect if you have any kind of slopes or if you have a situation that most of us have where the precipitation rate of your sprinkler system is much higher than the rate that the water can be taken in to your soil is. So if you have that situation, you're going to waste a lot of water to runoff. In that case, there's something called water cycling you can do. And what that amounts to is over a longer period of time, applying whatever water is recommended in shorter spurts. You could irrigate, for instance, up until the point where runoff just starts. At that point, you can actually water another station, come back, and while that soil's still moist, apply another 10 or 15 minutes of water. And you may need to apply it via cycling 2 or 3 times to get the amount of water in that's required that time of year for those particular plants. But it's almost a necessity anytime that you have slopes. And with most turf grass lawns, if you have an output of 1.5 or 2 inches of water per hour, it's a really good thing to consider doing. Another thing that's important is is to measure or get an idea of how moist your soil is in the root zone of the plants. We talked about that with the field test. There's something else you can do if you don't want to get your hands dirty, and that's use a soil sampling tube, a trowel, a soil probe, or simply straighten out one of those old type of metal coat hangers and see how deeply you can penetrate that into the soil. As soon as the soil gets hard, that will not be able to be pushed in easily anymore, and at that point, know that the roots are probably going to have trouble with any deeper penetration as well. You might want to think about what plants will grow there, which plants won't. You certainly don't want to plant a tree if you have a hard pan or if you have heavy clay soil and the roots won't be able to establish down adequately vertically. There's several other methods to conserve water in the landscape. One of them is to get the broom out and to minimize the use of water to clean sidewalks and driveways. I think that it's about time we all start doing more manual labor, and I got my broom out. It works really well, and it saves a lot of water. And you get a little exercise too. Another thing that's important is to remove weeds that compete with landscape plants for water. And that means all the weeds. They're all competitive, and many of them will outcompete your wanted plants. You can also go to the UC Davis Cooperative Extension IPM site. It's a wonderful resource, lots of free publications you can pull down and print, lots of advice, lots of pictures, a lot of good information on that website. Also, remember by definition that a plant out of place is a weed. So no matter how beautiful a mature tree is, if it wasn't planted in the correct location at the onset, then it's going to only be problematic throughout its lifespan. And unfortunately, that wastes water too, because you're going to have to replace it. We talked about water scheduling, which involves applying the right amount of water at the right time for the plants. It's important for established plants that you avoid watering every day. One common problem is that we tend to overwater established plants, and we tend to underwater newly planted establishing plants. Plants that are newly establishing have a very, very small root system. It needs to be kept moist. Even native plants through establishment need moisture. Established plants can mine a greater volume of soil water, so you tend to want to irrigate longer, but wait longer between irrigations with your established landscape plants. Also, to draw the roots down, you want to water a few inches below wherever the current root zone is. A lot of you have compost piles, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about using soil amendments such as compost in your garden and your landscape soils. One of the most important points in this is that anytime that you add a soil amendment, such as compost, that you don't just layer a little bit of it on the top. That would be a mulch on top of the soil. To be an effective soil amendment, you need to work it in deeply and evenly so that the soil that you're adding it to then is a homogeneous mixture of the original soil and the compost. And you want to make sure that you added at least 6 inches and deeper for shrubs. Compost added as a soil amendment can improve drainage in soils that contain high levels of clay and also in compacted soils. And compost can improve the water holding capacity in soils containing high levels of sand. So either way, compost is advantageous and will help a lot with your water scheduling. There's one case where we don't advocate the use of compost as a soil amendment at all, and that would be in tree planting sites. I don't need to have you run home, and I don't mean to scare you and take plants out if you've made the mistake that many of us have of making a small hole, throwing a little bit of compost in it, and then planting what in 20 or 30 years is going to be a mature, very large tree. But as you see in these slides, there can be some problems on down the line. You can end up basically with a house plant with circled roots growing in your backyard in a really small hole. And to avoid that, what you can do is make a really, really large hole, one that would sustain the volume of roots and soil needed to support that tree throughout its life. Or you can simply dig the hole, the recommended 2.5, 3 times the width of the pot that the tree was growing in at the nursery, and put the soil you removed back in. Loosen it, put it back in, and the tree will grow much better. And at some point, especially if you notched the edge of that hole that you removed the dirt from, you'll have the roots actually netting out into the native soil. So this is the one precaution, is avoid adding compost to tree planting sites. Another thing you can do to conserve water in your garden and landscape is to think about using permeable surfaces, infiltration basins, rainwater collection devices, and making sure that you're recycling your water. Gray water is something that a lot of us are using these days. You can either use it from your shower or from your washing machine. It's recycled water that's previously been used. Be careful and never apply it to any edible plants, even the roots, any of the parts of that plant, whether that's the part that you eat or not. In a mulch basin, irrigating a landscape that's ornamental and not edible, gray water can be a great asset. Be sure and check with your local jurisdiction, because in some cases, it's still not legal to use. Mulch is similar to applying compost as a soil amendment, but in this case, the organic matter is actually applied on top of the soil rather than mixed in the soil. In this case, wood chips, larger pieces of wood, chunks, pebbles, rocks, both inorganic and organic materials can make really good mulches. Here's a before and after shot, the same house. You can see the advantage of a new landscape mulch, giving the house an entirely new look. Here's some other pictures that I find very attractive, and mulch has been used in a way that helps to segue the landscape, and it's great for use in and among different hydrozones as well. It keeps weeds out, it holds water in, and just remember, if you're using wood chips, that every couple years you may have to replenish them to make sure you have about a 3-inch level of compost. Avoid over-fertilizing. This is something that is a really common thing that we do. It seems like if a little is good, a lot is better. What happens is too much nitrogen incurs this great flush of really weak growth that then you either have to water more or you have to cut off, and you end up with a weaker plant that has an increased water requirement. And in the long run, it's a plant that won't perform as well for you as one that has adequate fertilizer but isn't over-fertilized. Don't plant a weed. Some of the weeds are beautiful. Some of the weeds are sold as ornamental plants. The Scotch broom that you see, the don't plant, that's one that's lovely. Any of you driving up in the mountains in Central or Southern California have probably seen this plant. It's beautiful, it blooms profusely, but it's an invasive plant. It'll take over and it should be avoided. There's a couple websites that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is PlantRight and the other is cal.ipc.org. Both have extensive lists of plants that will substitute for otherwise invasive plants, and a good deal of information about avoiding invasive plants as well. I wanted to end my seminar speaking a little bit about keeping landscape and garden plants alive under drought or water restrictions. Some of you right now can only either on odd or even days water, or can only water perhaps once a month, or may have the water, if not turned off now, destined to be turned off sometime this summer. The first thing that's important to know is you need to recognize signs of drought and to separate those symptoms from insects, diseases, nematodes, any other kind of plant problem that may mimic symptoms of drought-infested plants. Of course, you want to reduce your water waste, and I think the most important point is you want to prioritize which plants to water when there just isn't enough water to go around. Here's some typical symptoms of drought-stressed plants. Remember that once you get irreversible damage, it's too late. You can't go back and undo it. So my advice is save your trees, your ornamentals and your fruit trees. You can plant grass, you can plant your vegetable garden, you can plant your other ornamentals later. But it's important to save those trees and use whatever water you have to make sure that you do. Common symptoms of drought: wilting, droopy leaves, chlorotic, yellow leaves. Sometimes the newer leaves are smaller, and a lawn can hold a footprint for several minutes. Some typical examples of drought. What's important to remember is just 1 or 2 very deep waterings for your mature trees can often keep them alive through a season. If you have 2 seasons of drought, it gets trickier and it's more difficult. But if you can irrigate 1 foot down to maybe 18 inches into that root zone, very likely you'll be able to save your trees. By the end of the 2nd season with absolutely no water, most of our common landscape trees that we have in our backyards will die or will start to show a lot more symptoms of drought stress and may or may not make it. So it's important, even if it's only 1 deep watering once in spring and perhaps not until the next spring, that minimally you do that. A garden hose works really well. The idea is to have the water come out very slowly, leave the hose on for quite a while, make sure that the water penetrates deeply into the root zone. And remember that the trunk should be kept dry. You should be watering the roots. And in some cases, those roots are mainly several feet out from the main trunk. And if you have a mature tree with roots throughout your backyard, you may want to water twice or 3 times as those roots over time enlarge and have a larger volume of soil and roots that need watering. So keep that in mind as your plants mature. Fruit and nut trees are really difficult to keep in production under drought. Remember, though, that you may lose a season or 2 of produce, but you could be in a safe situation and keep the tree alive. It may not produce, or it may produce small and few fruit, but a few deep waterings can keep your fruit and nut trees alive. And when and if there's water 2 or 3 years down the line, you can get them back into the production cycle that you're used to. In most cases, fruit and nut trees to produce need pretty constant wetting into the root zones from bloom through harvest. Peaches, plums, and nectarines, if you start irrigating the 4 to 6 weeks before harvest, and preferably we're able to irrigate them once in the spring deeply, they'll get by. In some cases, you can drastically prune the scaffolds way back to the trunk. It's a process called dehorning, and if push comes to shove, that'll keep these trees alive in severe drought. Citrus trees, just like the other trees, they require adequate soil moisture during spring to set fruit and a steady watering in summer and fall to produce acceptable numbers and quality of fruit. Again, irrigate them a few times very deeply, and you can probably get by with saving the trees. Vegetables are really difficult to maintain during a drought. As a rule of thumb, you have periods that is the filling period for the vegetable or the fruit that require water to get your crop, and there's certain vegetables that do better than others in drought. Tomatoes, beans, and carrots and other root crops, they tend to not tolerate long dry periods, whereas squash, if you have a lot of zucchini, they'll tend to do better. And you may have to gauge what your garden is going to be comprised of based on how much water is available. Shrubs are similar to trees, although usually you don't need to irrigate as deeply, and you can cut back to half of what you were watering them when there was enough water to retain them in a very healthy state and probably get by. Ground covers, the same thing. Spring watering every 4 to 6 weeks if you can in the summer, another watering. That'll probably get them through a drought. Lawns, remember that you're going to have much better luck with your Bermuda grass and your zorzias and your buffaloes than you do with your cool season grasses. They're more drought tolerant in the first place. They'll do better through drought, and they may turn brown, but often the Bermudas and zoysias will come back after a drought once they're watered again. You can use your lawn watering guide, cut the number of minutes in half, and probably get your lawn through hard times. Notice here that you had a lot of runoff, and so during times of drought, if you're turning the water off entirely, you're going to have some areas on slopes that probably are going to turn brown and may or may not come back, depending on when the next time is that you can apply more water. The water conservation is just a small portion of sustainable landscaping. We have a new publication. It's free. You can download it from our A&R catalog. It's called Sustainable Landscaping in California. It's about 21 pages. It covers IPM. It covers how to attract wildlife, how to conserve energy, and the topics that we spoke on today as well. Also, I'd like you to know that there's trained University of California Master Gardeners in almost every community of California. They're here to help you. If you'd like to become a volunteer Master Gardener, check out the website, find out when the upcoming classes are, and we invite you to apply to that program as well. The Master Gardeners are out and about. They're volunteers that look forward to receiving your questions and your inquiries and helping you solve your garden problems.